Welcome back to the Convo Couch, everyone. Pasta Jardula here, and I'm here with somebody who's pretty awesome, great journalist, one of the co-founders of the Gray Zone. How you doing? It's Ben Norton.
Good. I mean, almost falling asleep with how tired I am. It's almost 1 a.m. and we're waiting electoral results, but like pretty pumped. I mean, so a mixture of like adrenaline and dying of sleep, lack of sleep.
Yeah, me too. I'm like, get a chance to go to Bill Wee today, and it's just amazing coming to where you live. Everybody knows you live in Nicaragua, just an amazing country, whatnot. And I know why you live here now. It is just fabulous, beautiful, and a great place to live.
No, there's a lot of people who come down and they're like, now I understand why people love Nicaragua. So many people come here and they stay, and the revolutionary politics is like a huge draw. It's great to be feel like you're part of a revolutionary project. But it's also just a beautiful country. So I would recommend anyone watching this, like, come check out Nicaragua. Beautiful weather, beautiful beaches, good food, and revolutionary politics.
That's true. Well, let's talk about elections. Let's talk about revolutionary politics, because this is actually your wheelhouse. You just wrote an article a couple of days ago. Western media keeps on saying that Richard Ortega or David Ortega? Lost my mind. What?
It's 1 a.m., guys. Give us a break. We've been up since like 5 a.m. Daniel Ortega.
Oh my God. Well, the Western media is saying that he was jailing all his oppositions, that he was throwing them out of the country, and that's why he's going to assure himself a fourth consecutive term right now. You wrote an article about this. Can you give us a little explanation to what really happened and the justification behind what the Ortega government did?
Yeah, it's absurd propaganda, as always, in the corporate media. It's like the Nicaraguan equivalent of Iraqi WMDs, right? There's this idea, this narrative pushed by Western corporate media that the Ortega government, the Sandinista government in Nicaragua, supposedly detained all the pre-candidates, which is a term that means nothing. What is a pre-candidate? Like, I'm pre-candidate to be president of the United States. It means nothing. All it means is that, like, maybe I would one day like to be a candidate, but I'm not a candidate. So a pre-candidate has no legal definition. It's not a legal concept. It's just a term made up. So then they can say that the people who were detained were supposedly supposed to be candidates when they actually weren't. What actually happened is that in 2018, there was a brutally violent coup attempt here in which hundreds of Sandinistas were killed, tortured, hunted down, in which the U.S. government spent millions of dollars funding these extremist groups, media outlets pushing right-wing propaganda and fake news and calling for people to go out in the streets and try to overthrow the government and make these violent barricades called tranques, using the same playbook that the U.S. used in 2017 in Venezuela, a violent coup attempt. And the coup leaders, the coup plotters behind this violent putsch attempt were arrested and charged with conspiring with a foreign power, using millions of dollars from the U.S. government, which is a matter of public knowledge. We have these documents proving that they're funded by the U.S. government. Also, they violated laws on money laundering from taking these millions of dollars from the U.S. and not reporting it correctly and funneling it through like private foundations into their own bank accounts and all of these things, and violating laws on foreign agents. Nicaragua has a law on foreign agents, like the FARA law in the United States, which is a law that is over 80 years old, that says that if you take money from a foreign government and do their bidding and act on behalf of their interests, and you have to register as a foreign agent. So these coup plotters violated numerous laws and were arrested for it and are facing legal repercussions. And now the U.S. government and Western corporate media outlets say that the government detained the pre-candidates because the government didn't want a free and fair election. No, you all were electoral observers. I was an electoral observer as well. And there are 7 different options in the elections here in Nicaragua, which is more than in the U.S., where you have 2 options that are the same party with different names, the same policies. And here, the Sandinista Alliance, the Sandinista Front-led alliance, is one of the 7 options. There were 6 other opposition parties, 5 national opposition parties, and 1 regional opposition party in the Caribbean coast, which is an autonomous region, has political autonomy. So there are 6 different options on the ballot in the Caribbean and 5 other options throughout the country of right-wing, neoliberal, anti-Sandinista parties. But we're supposed to believe that this is a fraudulent election, supposedly, despite all of the evidence in front of us, because the U.S. government-funded coup plotters were arrested. At the end of the day, that's what Washington's narrative is. That's what Brussels' narrative is that you arrested our coup plotters, the people we funded, you arrested our employees, so we're going to try to discredit and delegitimize your government and your electoral process.
Are there any familiar NGOs that were involved in this time?
Absolutely. So basically what happens is that all of the opposition leaders in Nicaragua, the right-wing opposition leaders, the neoliberals, they get funding from the U.S. government, and the way that they kind of fund their operations, trying to destabilize the Sandinistas, is that they create their own personal NGOs, like a foundation or something, and most of the time they don't do anything. They publish a few reports, but all it is a way, it's a pass-through, so CIA cutouts like the National Endowment for Democracy, the NED, or the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, they can send this money to fund the opposition through these NGOs, through these foundations. One of the main foundations, for instance, is called the Chamorro Foundation. Yeah. The Chamorro family are the elite oligarchy. The Chamorros founded the modern state of Nicaragua. They're these rich elites, descendants of the Spanish colonialists. Since Nicaragua was founded 150 years ago, the Chamorros have had seven different presidents from the same family dynasty. I mean, they actually governed the country for even longer than the Somoza dynasty, and they've always tried to wrestle back power from the Sandinistas, trying to control the country, and the U.S. government has used the Chamorros to try to govern the country through a proxy, funding Violeta Chamorro, who was the first neoliberal president after the 1979 revolution, and after her campaign, after her term ended, Violeta Chamorro, after she sold off the country, after she privatized all of the state assets and she sold off the railroads and all of that, she created a foundation called the Chamorro Foundation, which is funded by the U.S. government with millions and millions of dollars, and then it acts as a repository, as a pass-through to send further money to other right-wing opposition outlets. And then there's other organizations. So for instance, there's this fake left opposition party, which is actually a right-wing party, that used to call itself the Movement for the Renovation of Sandinismo, which in 2020 dropped all references to Sandinismo. It stopped pretending to be Sandinistas, and now they call themselves UNAMOS. The leaders of this fake left opposition party, who are all neoliberals, who are all pro-imperialist, we have documents from WikiLeaks that are from classified documents from the U.S. State Department published by WikiLeaks. This is why Julian Assange is in prison. This is why he's a political prisoner. That's why he's being tortured, because these documents show that the leaders of this fake left opposition party, the MRS, like Dore Marietes, like Sergio Ramirez Mercado, and like others, some of whom are being detained for violating laws on foreign agents, for plotting the coup in 2018, that they have been U.S. embassy informants for at least 15 years. So anyway, the point is that the U.S. has so thoroughly penetrated every single level of Nicaraguan politics outside of the Sandinista front that basically all of the opposition parties are working for their paymasters in Washington. And you can't talk about free and fair elections when you have a global superpower meddling in your country, imposing sanctions, threatening more sanctions if people vote for the Sandinista front, funding coup plotters and the violent opposition, and then basically just coordinating directly with all these opposition leaders in regular meetings at the U.S. Embassy. How can you talk about free and fair elections when all of that's happening? The Nicaraguan government, to defend its sovereignty, to defend its democracy, it cracked down on this cabal of coup plotters directed, led, and funded by Washington, and now the U.S. is trying to punish Nicaragua for daring to take action against its assets. That's what's happening right now.
So here's the big question. Why? I mean, what major resources the United States wants? Usually it's about resource extraction, maybe getting the IMF in there. But in your personal opinion, you live here, you've done a lot of work on this. Why? What's the main goal of the U.S.? Is it because they don't want Americans to see a successful socialist government, or is there something more to it?
Well, there's a few reasons. It's always not just one reason, right? First of all, there's the threat of a good example. Nicaragua is the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, but that's not obvious. If you go to neighboring Honduras, it's horrible, unfortunately. Ever since the 2009 U.S.-backed coup, it had one of the highest murder rates in the world. It's extremely dangerous. There's gangs everywhere and drugs. Similarly, in El Salvador, one of the most violent countries in the world with drugs and gangs, and it's extremely unstable. And here in Nicaragua, it's a very stable country. It's a very safe country. There's universal free healthcare, universal free education. There's housing programs. There's a lot of social programs to help poor and working people. And this is in the second poorest country in the hemisphere after Haiti, which is a sign that if the government actually has the support of the people, if it's a progressive leftist government that is acting on behalf of the working class, then the government can provide these programs. Meanwhile, the richest country in the world, the United States, can't provide any of that stuff to its people because because it's not a government that acts on behalf of the people. It's not a democracy. It's a plutocracy. It's a capitalist bipartisan dictatorship in which you have two virtually identical parties who just use culture war stuff to pretend like they're changing politics. And the faces change, but the politics never change. The policies never change. Whereas here, the U.S. is complaining that the faces haven't changed, but the policies have changed. There's not neoliberal policies. There's policies to help people, to help working people to rise out of poverty, to develop their country. And then there's also the fact that Nicaragua is in an alliance with other anti-imperialist governments. Nicaragua is a member of the Bolivarian alliance with Venezuela and Cuba and other Caribbean nations and Bolivia. And also Nicaragua is part of a growing movement, an anti-imperialist movement. There's a new bloc at the United Nations called the Group of the Friends in Defense of the United Nations Charter. And it consists of China, Russia, the DPRK, Palestine, Venezuela, Cuba, a bunch of anti-imperialist countries coming together to try to defend national sovereignty, to fight imperialism, to fight the international dictatorship that is imperialism, led by Washington and also its junior partners in imperialism in Brussels and Israel and Saudi Arabia. And then furthermore, there's the geostrategic location of Nicaragua. For over 100 years, imperialists have been trying to build a canal through the middle of Nicaragua. And this goes back to Cornelius Vanderbilt and the robber barons of the 19th century. They had made all these plans to try to turn Nicaragua basically into what they did to Panama, to turn it into try to colony, and then to try to basically just control all the politics and then control all international trade that goes through the Americas by going through Nicaragua. They tried for not decades, centuries. They have tried to build a canal, and the Nicaraguan government recently tried to build a canal with a Chinese company, which of course terrified the U.S. So the U.S. funded all of these groups to try to stop and destabilize the canal project. The point is that Nicaragua has been a target of U.S. imperialism for well over 100 years. The final other most important factor is that this is a country that has repeatedly shown over more than 100 years that it's willing to fight and resist imperialism. Since the 1850s, when a white American who didn't speak Spanish came here, William Walker, and declared himself fake president of Nicaragua, and then tried to reinstate slavery in Nicaragua, and then going up to the U.S. military occupations of Nicaragua in the early 20th century, leading to the rise of Augusto Sandino, the revolutionary guerrilla, who created not just a Nicaraguan peasant army, but a pan-Latin American army with revolutionaries from across Latin America who came to Nicaragua, who saw what was called the Army in Defense of Sovereignty, that was the name of the army of Sandino, the Army in Defense of Sovereignty. They saw that as a revolutionary project, a symbol. Nicaragua was a symbol across Latin America of how to resist U.S. imperialism, how to resist the Monroe Doctrine. So Nicaragua has been a thorn in the side of the U.S. empire for well over 100 years, and it has tried to recolonize the country as it did in the Somoza dictatorship era from the 1930s until 1979, and as it did from 1990 until 2006. When the Sandinistas came back in 2007, Nicaragua once again became free and sovereign, and Washington has tried once again to recolonize it because at the end of the day, Nicaragua is the threat of a good example.
So Daniel Ortega is well on his way to winning his fourth term right now. There's a lot of things he's done in the past. What can he do in the future? Do you think, what's the future look like for Nicaragua? Now that we have the Renouncer Act, right, with all these sanctions coming on, a lot of Sandinista people have told me that Daniel Ortega was preparing for this day. So what's the future going to look like in Nicaragua with facing these sanctions, with the possibility he'll win his fourth consecutive term?
That's absolutely right, that Nicaragua is prepared for the sanctions and the blockade that are coming. So in the 1980s, the United States waged a terrorist war in Nicaragua using the Contra death squads armed by the CIA. And there was also an economic blockade in Nicaragua in the 1980s, like the blockade on Cuba and the blockade on Venezuela. Now, John Bolton, the neocon Iraq war architect, who is National Security Advisor for Trump, John Bolton referred to three countries in Latin America as the so-called troika of tyranny: Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. Cuba and Venezuela already have blockades. It's obvious that the U.S. is going to impose a blockade on Nicaragua next, so that's coming down the path. So immediately they're going to pass the Renacer Act, Biden is going to sign into law in the next few days, which is going to impose like a financial blockade on Nicaragua. Then they're going to try to kick out Nicaragua from the CAFTA trade agreement, the Central American trade agreement going back to the Bush era, before the Sandinistas actually, when they entered CAFTA. And then they're going to try to kick Nicaragua out of the OAS, but the OAS is already the Yankee Ministry of the Colonies, as Cuba said. It's always been a tool of U.S. imperialism. Then they're going to try to isolate Nicaragua in regional trade, to try to prevent Nicaragua from trading with its neighbors in other parts of Latin America. And then they're going to probably orchestrate more violence, another coup attempt. They're going to use everything in the handbook that they've been using against Cuba and Venezuela for these many decades. But the reality is, as you just said, Nicaragua has been preparing for a long time. President Ortega remembers the years of the 80s under the blockade and the terrorist war, and they've also learned from the situations in Cuba and Venezuela. These are three countries. The U.S. calls them the Troika of Tyranny. They're actually the Troika of Resistance, and they're close allies. They're all members of the ALBA. They all work together. They share tactics. They discuss how they can work together against the dictatorship of the U.S. empire. And they're in Nicaragua. It's clear the government is prepared not only economically and politically, but in terms of food, which is very important, because when the Sandinistas came back to power, they emphasized the importance of food sovereignty. Nicaragua is a largely agricultural country, and it produces more than 90% of the food that it consumes here in the country. So Nicaragua is prepared for the U.S. blockade that is coming, and it's very likely that it's going to try to bring back the canal project to try to reinvigorate the economy, perhaps working with China and Russia and other countries, and help be part of this project of building a new multipolar world, a new axis to the axis of resistance globally, not just in West Asia and the Middle East, but globally, trying to resist the dictatorship led by the U.S. empire and Brussels and the IMF and World Bank. It's already part of this international project. It has close relations with Vietnam and Cuba and Russia and other countries, and it's very likely that Nicaragua is going to keep moving forward. So unfortunately, I think the situation here in the next few years is going to become more difficult, but as it becomes more difficult, the revolution will further radicalize, it'll continue moving to the left, and the Nicaraguan people will be more and more willing to defend their sovereignty, because at the end of the day, as I said, Nicaraguans, if there's one thing that defines Nicaraguan history for over 100 years, it has been a willingness to fight, to defend their sovereignty, to refuse to be colonized.
Well, you know, I always think it's important for the next leader to be in place, or someone who's coming up. Is there anybody in Nicaragua that maybe Daniel Ortega can hand a torch to? Or is there any particular type of party or person that we can look to in the future, maybe?
Well, what's good is the Sandinista front is extremely well organized. It's by far the biggest political force. It's the only real political force in the country. The right-wing opposition is corrupt and divided, and they're all narcissists, and they all want to be president, so they all hate each other, including there are multiple siblings and cousins in the Chamorro oligarchy who they hate each other too. So the reality is the Sandinista front is a very vibrant force, and the lifeblood of the Sandinista front is the Sandinista youth, which is based in working-class barrios, and there are a lot of young people who are great organizers, who are very militant, who have developed ideology and class consciousness. There's a whole generation of young people and middle-aged people who are part of the government. What's really incredible about this government is that this is truly a working-class government. A lot of the ministers, a lot of the mayors, they come from working-class backgrounds. They were militants in the Sandinista youth, and they entered the government through their activism in the Sandinista party and the Sandinista front. They didn't just enter the government because they were from like an upper-middle-class elite background and had a higher education and all that. No, the Sandinista front is a vibrant force, and they definitely have a whole generation of very impressive leaders that have been developed over these years of cadre. It's they're not just members, it's a cadre development organization. This is a vanguard party, so they're not going to have any shortage of people in the future to help continue leading the country.
Ben, you were fired tonight, and you're tired as can be. I hate to see what you're like and how heated up you can be when you got a lot of rest, buddy. Thank you so much. Everybody can find Ben Norton, Gray Zone. Man's Fire, read a lot of great articles as of late. Go check them out. Election observing over here in Nicaragua. Thank you for the interview, bro.
Convo Couch. You guys are awesome. It's always a pleasure to be on with you guys, and I'm so happy you all came down. It's really important for independent U.S. media to come down to Latin America to see with your own eyes what's happening. It's actually not as hard as people think. So anyone who's watching this, think about coming, checking out Nicaragua, Venezuela, Cuba. It's really inspiring, and it could change your life.
Thank you. You guys have been such an inspiration. As anti-imperialists, you guys have led the way in independent media. Thank you, Ben Norton.
Thank you all.
Pastor Jardula, Convo Couch. We'll see you tomorrow. Thank you, brother. That's awesome. You're fired.